If you're looking for a zero emissions vehicle and you're not quite sold on battery electric technology, or perhaps you don't have anywhere to charge your battery electric vehicle and you live in a very, very small number of places in the world, you might want to take a look at the Hyundai Nexo right next to me. This is one of only 2 production hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in the entire world, but it does look like there's going to be a BMW fuel cell vehicle, at least in Europe, sometime very, very soon. In this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Nexo and how it compares to hybrid vehicles and battery electric vehicles, but I'll also be talking about hydrogen realities and why I think hydrogen still has a future in the United States. Full disclosure, I do have a different perspective on hydrogen fuel cell vehicles than some folks out there, because as far as I know, I am the only person in the automotive review industry that has ever actually owned a fuel cell vehicle, and I did in fact end up with a Hyundai Nexo for some of the reasons I'm going to talk about in this video. But the biggest of them is that the Nexo is a hatchbacky crossover shaped vehicle, and up till this point, all the other fuel cell vehicles had been sedans, of course, other than Hyundai's first attempt at a fuel cell vehicle, and that made it a lot more practical than the Mirai. I do think the Mirai is terribly pretty, but it is terribly impractical as a vehicle in North America because it has a really small trunk and it's a sedan with kind of a tight back seat. The Nexo, on the other hand, is a 380-mile range hydrogen vehicle, and it's quite attainable. First things first, let's talk about what the Nexo is and what it is not. The Nexo is not a high-performance EV. This is not an all-wheel drive vehicle. It's a front-wheel drive model with under 200 horsepower under the hood, and it blends right in with the rest of the Hyundai lineup. On the outside, it's approximately the same size as a Toyota Venza. This is one of the first vehicles in Hyundai's lineup to get their latest design language, although that has started to change as Hyundai has released subsequent products. This has the divorced headlight arrangement that we see in other Hyundai vehicles, with this very distinctive LED strip running right across the front. You'll notice that there is more of an air intake going on here than we find in an electric vehicle because the cooling requirements of a hydrogen fuel cell stack are slightly different. It doesn't necessarily require more cooling than an EV, it requires different cooling, and it requires a decent amount of airflow into the fuel cell stack itself. Dimensionally, the Nexo is pretty close to the Toyota Venza. This is a little bit shorter in terms of overall length, but it has a wheelbase about 4 inches longer than the Venza. It's also a little bit wider than that Toyota model, with an interior volume pretty similar, but actually a bigger cargo area in the back. So that should give you an idea of how big the Nexo is in reality. Now, one of the big benefits to fuel cell technology versus a battery electric vehicle is weight savings. This is 3,990 pounds in terms of curb weight. That may sound like a lot, but that Venza is 3,913 pounds because of its hybrid system. And really the way that this operates is kind of like a blend of hybrid and EV, but I'll talk about that drivetrain in a little bit. Versus the Venza or an Ioniq 5, there is one thing to keep in mind. We don't have all-wheel drive available in the Nexo. I wish they had been able to stick a tiny electric motor on the rear. The reason they probably couldn't do that is because the hydrogen tanks are located under this area of the vehicle. Now, obviously, I should talk about the Ioniq 5 at this moment. This is about 500 pounds lighter than an Ioniq 5 in rear-wheel drive format, where the performance is going to be a little bit closer to this as far as 0 to 60, but the Ioniq 5 is going to give you, in the real world, about 100 miles less range. And one important thing to keep in mind with something like this Nexo is that aerodynamics seem to be a lot less important when you can carry the kind of energy that this has on board, which is why we find less aerodynamic wheels there. We also find a design that is far less aerodynamic than something like an EV6. There is a bit of an homage to aerodynamics. We have kind of an aero fin right there. We do have power handles on the doors, but we don't have extremely aerodynamically efficient mirrors or active grille shutters or anything like that going on up front. The sort of lower focus on aerodynamics is also obvious from the rear end, where we find a really pinched-in greenhouse in high-efficiency EVs like an EV6 or, honestly, something along the lines of a Tesla Model Y. This has a much more upright format, although obviously it's definitely rounded back here and has really aerodynamic taillights. It has a power hatch right here with a relatively low load-in height, also a little bit different than some EVs because this doesn't have a skateboard-style battery pack. Under the hood is where we find the fuel cell stack. The reason it's called a stack is because it's made up of individual fuel cell elements that are relatively small. They're all packaged in this area. This is one of the first hydrogen vehicles where the fuel cell actually fits entirely under the hood. There has been a lot of focus on miniaturization of fuel cell technology and, of course, improving efficiency, but miniaturization is really important because you got to be able to stuff it in a vehicle. And the very first Mirai, some portions of the drivetrain actually ended up under the front seats, and that made it kind of strangely packaged. Here, everything is under the hood. If you want to know in excruciating detail how fuel cells work, there are tons of online resources, but let's just talk at a high level about what's going on under this hood. Again, multiple different fuel cells going on here. Inside each one of those fuel cells, we have a proton exchange membrane. Hydrogen enters on the anode side of this contraption. There's a catalyst that splits the electrons and protons apart. So you end up with essentially positively charged hydrogen and negatively charged hydrogen, which is basically just protons and electrons. The protons go through the membrane and are met by oxygen on the other side. The electrons go around the electrical loop and then, of course, return on the cathode side of this contraption, where the oxygen is, where the protons have gone across that membrane. Everything recombines to H2O. So yes, you could say this is an oxidation reaction, but it's not burning the hydrogen as some people assume. And that means that fuel cells tend to run at relatively low temperatures, at least specifically this kind of hydrogen fuel cell. There is some cooling required for the fuel cell stack itself, but there's also some heating required in colder weather. Going in for a closer look, the fuel cell stack is right here in this module, which also under there contains the electric drive motor. Some related electronics as well go on there. There's a coolant tank over there and an air filter, which is kind of a novelty here for an electric vehicle. That's because of the air that has to get blown into the fuel cell stack. When you rev the vehicle up, you're basically out on the road and you floor it, you hear a lot of whooshing sounds. Most of that is due to the air that's required for that reaction to occur. Rather unfortunately, I cannot demonstrate that when the vehicle is stationary, but in the first generation Mirai, it sounded kind of like a really loud hairdryer under your butt. In this vehicle, it sounds just more like an air whooshing sound coming from underneath the hood. Now on to some technical details. System power total comes in at 135 kilowatts. That powers the 161 horsepower electric motor, also good for 291 pound-feet of torque. Of that 135 kilowatts, 95 can come from the fuel cell stack. That is its maximum power output. So this is a little bit less powerful than the one that we find in the Mirai. In case you're wondering, the rest of the power comes from the battery pack in the rear. So if you are driving up longer distance slopes, there will be a point where 95 kilowatts is all the vehicle can produce. And at that point, it does come across feeling like a first generation Nissan Leaf because power output from the electric motor drops down to somewhere around 120 horsepower. Fuel cell vehicles use a battery pack for much the same reason that a hybrid vehicle uses one. You can get a higher peak output for the system total, and also it takes a while for the fuel cell stack to ramp from 0 power output to 100% and then back to 0 again. So the balance is handled by that battery in the rear. It also gives you regenerative braking, and in situations where maybe it was more efficient to run the fuel cell at a higher output and then store the energy in the battery pack, it can do that and then shut the fuel cell down to a lower roar. If you're wondering why we don't have plug-in fuel cell vehicles, well, I've always wondered that myself because this is the kind of vehicle where they probably could have squeezed maybe a 10 kilowatt hour battery pack on board. That would have been kind of nifty. We had been promised some plug-in fuel cell vehicles, but you all know how that little startup went wrong. But I digress. Let's get back to the hydrogen tech itself. 6.33 kilograms of hydrogen is the capacity of the tanks on board the Nexo. That will get you 380 miles if you choose the base version, just over 350 miles if you get the top-end limited version, which has 245 with tires and a few extra features to make this a bit heavier. Now, what's really interesting about hydrogen is its energy density. We're talking only 14 pounds of fuel, plus, of course, the weight of the tanks in the rear. But they store collectively about 212 kilowatt hours of energy. That's, according to the DOE, how you would translate that to electrical energy. That's about the capacity of a Hummer EV, the biggest battery pack in a production electric vehicle at the moment in the world. And for the record, that weighs more than double this Hyundai Nexo. The battery pack in that vehicle alone weighs almost as much as the Nexo. It's over 3,000 pounds of batteries in that Hummer. Now, yes, the fuel cell stack in here is not 100% efficient. In fact, this one is about 67% efficient. So you put 212 kilowatt hours of hydrogen essentially into the tanks, you can get 142 kilowatt hours out of it. So it's really obvious that the Nexo is less focused on EV efficiency than we find in the most efficient EVs out there. In fact, if you could get this vehicle to be as aerodynamic as something like the Ioniq 6 or the Kia EV6, this would likely be able to go 550 to 600 miles on that 142 kilowatt hours of usable energy. That is the promise and the entire reason behind hydrogen fuel cell vehicles like this. They're relatively lighter weight, so you use less rubber for the tires, you use less brakes, etc. You use less energy to move the vehicle down the road, and because you can store so much more energy on board, it would be a lot easier to have longer range vehicles. If you wanted to double the range on this vehicle, you would probably just about double the hydrogen capacity and you'd be just fine. There would be an incremental weight increase in the vehicle, of course, but maybe we're talking about an extra 400 pounds. If you want to double the range in something like an Ioniq 5, which in its longest range format comes in well below this in real world driving, you would need to far more than double the battery pack. And that battery pack already weighs well over 1,000 pounds. So we're probably talking about an 1,800 to 2,000 pound weight increase on a relatively small vehicle. That definitely is problematic. Now, you might be able to get there with solid-state batteries, but remember that solid-state batteries are not focusing on energy density as far as weight. They're talking about volumetric density improvements with solid-state batteries. So the battery pack itself may get smaller, but it's not going to be very much lighter. In fact, there are current lithium-ion technologies right now that will approach the weight to power density that we find in the early solid-state batteries that are headed to production soon. So solid-state batteries aren't going to solve everything, and they certainly aren't going to solve the refueling process, which is only about 5 minutes here. Now, you might be wondering, where does the water go? Well, there is an easy way to show you, because in the refreshed Nexo, we now have an H2O Out button. The byproduct from driving the Nexo is literally pure H2O with absolutely nothing else in it. But some amount is stored in the fuel cell and other related plumbing systems, and when you park the vehicle, it will just drain out onto the ground. That's fine in a parking lot, but if you have a garage and you don't want your floor wet, you might want to use the H2O Out button, and then you can really get a good idea of exactly how much water is shooting out of the Nexo. And there you can see the puddle and that steady stream of water. In more regular driving, most of the water comes out as vapor, and interestingly, this is the only EV in the world that I know of with twin exhausts. One over here and one over there on the other side of the vehicle. Exactly why Hyundai went in this design direction, I really don't know. The big promise for fuel cell technology is fast charging, essentially. Fueling happens right back here behind this little door, and it's going to charge 9 times faster than the fastest DC fast charging vehicle available in the United States. An Ioniq 5, if you want to go from 0% to 100% charge, is going to take about 45 minutes, and that is wicked, wicked fast for a modern EV, and it's consuming a lot of power while doing so. This is going to take about 5 minutes. We'll talk more about availability of hydrogen, of course, a little bit later. And that charge is going to get you 25% further than the longest range Ioniq 5. This is 10% lighter than the Ioniq 5. It has a 10% larger cargo area than the Ioniq 5 as well. So you can see that there are definitely some advantages here. Behind the power hatch, we find a cargo area that's a little bit larger than the Toyota Venza, and we have some storage space right here under the load floor. Just about enough room to put your can of Fix-A-Flat, the tire iron, storage net, things like that, right down there in that divider area. Thankfully, the cargo area is fairly square, and if I lift up the load floor, let's take a look and see what's going on under here. At what I guess you'd call the front of the cargo area, we find an electronics module. We then find the lithium-ion battery pack. To develop this vehicle, Hyundai chose to use some existing components. So the motor is recycled from a Hyundai EV, and the battery pack is recycled from a Hyundai hybrid vehicle, which is why it's air-cooled. This is the cooling fan right over here. There would have been a little bit more space back here if Hyundai had packaged the battery a little bit differently, and I do wish that the battery was a little bit larger. The usable capacity is around 1.5 kilowatt hours. From this angle, you can also see the bump in the unibody for one of the hydrogen tanks below there. The other 2 tanks are below that area. Not too much has changed on the inside of the Nexo since I had mine, but the interior is still futuristic, one of the reasons that I kind of liked the interior in mine. We have hydro-adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passengers, lots of recycled and green materials on the inside, fairly comfortable front seats. The driver's seat has adjustable lumbar support, but the passenger seat does not. Heated and ventilated seats, of course. I kind of like this 2-tone blue interior. There are definitely some interesting touches in here, a little bit quirky. So one of the things here is this cup holder on the passenger side. I found that a little bit awkward because getting in and out of the vehicle where there's a cup there, that is problematic. We have a decently sized glove compartment over here on the passenger side. We have a 2 LCD setup on the dashboard. This is one of the first Hyundai vehicles to get this kind of layout. But because of the way they've chosen to shape this little binnacle here, it still has one, unlike some of the modern Hyundais, they couldn't put a really large LCD over here on the driver's side. The driver's side instrument cluster is a little bit larger than when the Nexo first debuted. It's also running more modern software to keep it in tune with the rest of the Hyundai lineup. But this screen is basically the same as when the Hyundai launched with the latest Hyundai software. So if I go back here, you can see that we have that home screen that we find in a number of other Hyundais with a little bit of mapping information over there on that side and infotainment. And then we can scroll through and you can see that the options are pretty similar. One interesting thing that I noticed, however, is that the fuel cell vehicle now no longer shows you how full the battery is. That's kind of an interesting twist. Moving down there, we found all the buttons that every other car manufacturer has decided to excise from their interior. It kind of reminds me of maybe a Star Trek kind of console thing going on here. Lots and lots of buttons. Infotainment buttons, climate buttons, seat heating and ventilation buttons, buttons for the shifter, buttons and knobs for the infotainment screen, even though it is a touch screen. We then find the electric parking brake there. Pretty big storage area there under. Another funky touch, the USB cord right there for your smartphone is in this little storage area, which you can close off, and you can route the cord through that little hole, so you could put your smartphone under the console, but that doesn't strike me as a terribly convenient location, and I just found myself always ending up with the smartphone, chasing it around by its cord, and then dropping it right in there. We have one good cup holder right there, and then a reasonable amount of storage space right there under that center console armrest. This was one of the first vehicles to get Hyundai's highway driving assistance system, but unlike other Hyundais, you don't turn it on and off with buttons on the steering wheel. You do have to kind of trip through the software, and that's kind of annoying. We do have radar adaptive cruise control over here on this side, buttons for the infotainment center on that side, and I think a fairly attractive and comfortable steering wheel. I do find myself kind of grabbing around this bump in the bottom of the wheel quite often, so that's kind of a design I hope they repeat on other vehicles. We have regen paddles on the back. These operate very much like they do in electric Hyundais. Another big win for the Nexo is a roomy back seat. This seat is in its most upright position, but it does have quite a lot of recline. And no matter where I put the back seat, even in this really upright and very uncomfortable position, I still have about ½ an inch of headroom left. And that's because the ceiling and the roofline is definitely higher than most EVs, including the Ioniq 5. Because again, efficiency seems to be a little bit less important. Moving to the middle seat, you'll notice that the bench is not as wide as a Blazer or an Edge, but it's right in line with something along the lines of a Venza, and again, that Ioniq 5. Scooting all the way over to the right side of the vehicle, this front seat is all the way back in its tracks, which is further back than we find in something like that Venza. I have about ½ an inch of legroom left right there. But this is certainly something that I could do for a few hours if I needed to, because the back seat itself is pretty comfortable and pretty roomy, as long as you don't put someone in the middle. As far as child seat fitment goes, we have top tether anchors for all 3 seating positions, latch anchors in the outboard seating positions, and there is enough room to just barely put a rear-facing child seat behind me at 6 feet tall driving the vehicle. On the downside, the shoulder belt for the middle passenger does come out of the ceiling, and I did find that annoying after having lived with the Nexo for 3 years. Now it's time to get the Nexo out on the road, so obviously the first thing we need to do is floor it. 0 to 60 is going to happen in 8.8 seconds. And it feels just like a front-wheel drive EV, because that's basically what it is. It's just an EV with a different kind of battery pack. Now, if you are driving uphill or you're floored for long periods of time, you are going to end up with slower 0 to 60 times after a while, because the fuel cell stack is only producing a portion of the power. Some of it has to come from the battery in the back. And that's kind of why I wish they had given this a bigger battery pack. Also, you should know, if you live in a hilly area like I do, the battery pack will end up getting full before you reach the bottom of the hill, and then it's going to have to start using the friction brakes in order to slow the vehicle down. I think Hyundai could have done a slightly better job about blending in the friction brakes to give this sort of an engine brakey feel on those longer downhill slopes, but they chose not to. So essentially what happens is you reach a point where just it stops regenerating, and then you're sort of freewheeling down the hill. When it comes to braking, this model stopped in 125 feet from 60 miles an hour. That is a little bit shorter than the last Nexo that I tested, but right in line with a hybrid option like a Toyota Venza. Also right in line with something like the Venza is the handling ability. This has fairly wide 245 width tires on it, and with a curb weight right around 4,000 pounds or so, it's more nimble than you might suspect. This is certainly a lot lighter than a number of EVs, so this is certainly going to handle a little bit better than a Mustang Mach-E. Now, it's not going to handle the same as far as the driving characteristics because of the weight balance, but depending on the situation, this actually may end up handling better. And I certainly prefer this as far as its handling ability to the base Mach-E, because those tires are a little on the skinny side, which is why on our long-term Mach-E, I ended up swapping in wider, grippier summer tires that really help things out. And of course, the Mach-E GT is going to be better. Now, handling is a combination of center of gravity. This is going to be higher than the average battery electric vehicle, but also curb weight. This is definitely going to be lighter than something like the long-range versions of the Mustang Mach-E. And then, of course, weight balance, whether that weight is in the front or in the rear, or whether it's more evenly distributed, as we find in most modern EVs. Bearing all of those factors in mind, I'm going to give the handling score an A-, and I would say that this is probably a more logical competitor to something like maybe a BZ4X or the Nissan Ariya than the rear-wheel drive options in this segment, like Hyundai's own Ioniq 5. Out on a rougher road like the one that I'm on here, I'm going to give ride quality an A. Versus most battery electric vehicles, the Nexo comes across as a little bit more supple, a little bit more compliant, and there's certainly more suspension motion. And the suspension doesn't have as much weight to damp, which is definitely a key characteristic that we see in a lot of electric vehicles, where the suspension tends to be kind of firm and bouncy because you only have so much suspension motion and you've got a lot of weight to control, 5,000, 6,000 pounds in some EVs. That definitely makes those designs a little bit harder to tune on the softer side like the Nexo. The result is that out on the paved road, ride quality and handling are, I think, better balanced than we find in the average gasoline crossover that this might compete with, especially than the average hybrid. Now, full battery electric vehicles, that tends to be a little bit trickier. They are going to be heavier, but they're generally going to have a better weight balance. And if we're looking at something like the Ioniq 5 or an EV6, which are also made by the Hyundai Kia conglomerate, those are rear-wheel drive, so they're going to have a definite different handling dynamic than we find in this. But we do have 245 with tires, so when it comes to raw grip numbers, this does really well, and I think that Hyundai found a really good balance between ride quality and handling. The fuel cell stack definitely weighs more, and the electric motor weighs more than the hydrogen tanks in the back, so as far as weight balance goes, this is a little bit closer to the average front-wheel drive crossover. In my cabin noise testing, I measured 69.5 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour. That is a little bit louder than the last Nexo that I drove, primarily because the road surface was repaved and a lot of the numbers moved around a bit. This is still quieter than average for a compact crossover, so something like a Venza or a RAV4 or CR-V, those are certainly going to be louder inside. Likely due to the general design of the vehicle and perhaps a little bit more sound deadening, this cabin is a little bit quieter than the base rear-wheel drive version of the Ioniq 5. Interestingly, this sounds a lot like the Ioniq 5 when you floor it, because you do hear that electric motor just a little bit inside, but you'll also hear something a little bit different. You'll hear the fuel cell stack with that blower blowing air through the stack itself. It kind of sounds like a very quiet hairdryer off in the distance. As far as fuel economy goes, it's really difficult to comment. This is going to be a little less efficient than a Mirai, as you'd expect, but what do we really compare this to? So I'm just going to give this a question mark when it comes to efficiency. Bottom line, if you're looking for something that is novel, interesting, you want to get this. By the way, that bing was that the battery is now full, so now I get limited regen braking as we go down the hill. I do think it's a little annoying that it bings rather than just giving you that message, but that's what I mentioned earlier. Now, back to this. What do we compare it to? There's really nothing else out there other than the Mirai. You could get something like a Nissan Ariya. That's kind of similar format, pretty accommodating, pretty comfortable, also a little bit quirky, not overly speedy in that base front-wheel drive version. But you're going to need to be interested in fuel cell technology and, of course, live next to a hydrogen station if you want to get a Nexo. Not everything with fuel cell vehicles is peachy keen, so let's talk about the dirty underbelly, I guess you could say, about hydrogen fuel cell cars. The most frequently cited problem is, where does the hydrogen come from? And this is where things get murky, because I hear a lot of folks out there saying, well, most of the hydrogen comes from natural gas or fossil fuels. Well, that's true as far as global production of hydrogen goes. Over 95% of hydrogen, however you buy it, whether you're just going to the local gas store or someone's using it for industrial processes, over 95% of that comes from a fossil fuel source, mostly steam reformation of natural gas. You can make it a little bit greener with what they call green hydrogen by capturing the carbon after that process, sequestering it wherever it is they do that, and then theoretically that is a lower emission source, but it's still fossil fuel based. Then you can make hydrogen from completely renewable sources. There are algae sources, and then there's, of course, electrolysis, which is the most common source for renewable hydrogen. Now, in California, fuel cell vehicles must be fueled with at least 33% renewable hydrogen. And most hydrogen fuel stations in California dispense only 100% renewable hydrogen. True Zero is the largest dispenser of hydrogen for vehicles like this, the Mirai, the Old Clarity, etc., and the majority of their stations operate 100% renewable hydrogen dispensing. So this particular problem is not realistically a problem for fuel cell vehicles like this. Now, currently some Shell stations, Air Liquide stations, and the Iwanti stations in California are down there closer to the 33% requirement, but the majority of the places you will fill a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, you're going to be filling it with almost 100% renewable hydrogen. More of a valid complaint is, where do we find hydrogen? And this is a common thing that I get asked a lot. Yes, not very many hydrogen stations exist. There are only about 53 currently operating in California, 55 depending on how you count. There are another approximately 9 or 10 in construction, and then maybe about 20 planned. Any way you slice it, if you don't live near a hydrogen station, do not get one of these because it will make your life very, very difficult. You need to either work next to a hydrogen station, live next to a hydrogen station, or commute between the one and the other, which is exactly how I ended up with the Nexo. There are 3 hydrogen stations on the way from my home to my office, but 0 in the county that I live in. This is the kind of vehicle, however, that you can drive around in California as long as you're not going to some of those far-reaching places. Geographically, hydrogen stations are also fairly limited. Most of them happen in the Los Angeles metro area. The San Francisco Bay Area has the second highest concentration, then the Sacramento metro area, and then oddly enough, San Diego comes in next, even though San Diego's the second largest city in California. There's also a station in the middle of the state around Harris Ranch. Sometimes that station ends up broken, I hear. There's also one in Santa Barbara, and then there's one in Tahoe. So you can go skiing in your Nexo. I have literally done that and experienced cold weather driving in the Nexo. I'll talk about that in a bit. And you can definitely drive it from Northern California to Southern California and vice versa. In fact, during the COVID-19 shutdown, my Nexo was what I took back and forth, because I was still going down to Southern California every approximately 2 weeks to review cars, and this was just the easiest vehicle to take. Even when we were doing our long-term testing on the Mach-E and the Tesla Model 3, I still drove this down to Southern California for the majority of the time because, quite simply, it could refill in 5 minutes and the Mach-E and the Model 3 absolutely could not. The Mach-E and Model 3 also required at least 2 stops in order to get to Los Angeles and back, whereas this only required a single fill-up to make that round trip. Cold weather operation was a bit of a concern for some early fuel cell designs, but not anymore. This one is rated for negative 30 degrees Celsius, that's about negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Nowhere in California gets that cold, so it's absolutely not a problem. In fact, in the continental US, really nowhere gets that cold on a regular basis either. This has the ability to do cold startups because it will heat the fuel cell stack, and then after you're done driving it, it will dry the stack to make sure that all the water has been removed. But there's actually an advantage to cold weather driving in a fuel cell vehicle. You see, hydrogen in the tanks doesn't care. It's stored in a gaseous form, so it's not going to freeze up, anything like that. And in a battery electric vehicle, you have to condition the battery in cold weather. Not only are you heating the cabin, you're heating the battery. Chemically, the battery is not able to deliver as much energy when it's cold, so they have to heat the battery. That ends up consuming energy, but then you get a little bit more ability to draw power out of the battery. And in cold weather, that could consume 15–20% of your range, depending on exactly how the battery is being heated and how warm the battery needs to be. This does not have that problem. You're only using energy to heat the cabin. Now, a definite downside is cost of operation and cost to purchase. This starts at $59,435, goes up to $62,885. But there are pretty inexpensive leases, which is why I ended up with the Nexo in the first place. It was $520 a month, and it included all the fuel you could consume. Fuel, that is another question. Currently, it's about $15 a kilogram. So right now, to drive this 350 miles or 380 miles, depending on the version you get, it'll cost you about 25 cents a mile. That's definitely more expensive than driving a Toyota Venza, even at $5 a gallon. That's going to be right around 12 to 15 cents a mile. But the reality is that almost nobody is paying for fuel in their fuel cell vehicle because the vast majority of these are leased, and if you're interested in one, I would highly recommend leasing it. And if you lease one, all the fuel you can consume in 3 years is included with the lease of this or a Mirai. So the only fuel cell vehicles you see out there where people are actually paying is if somehow they have a really old one that they've hung on to and they decided to buy one instead. Now, if you CPO a Nexo or CPO a Mirai, they generally seem to give you another $15,000 worth of fuel in order to fill the vehicle. So really nobody out there is paying for hydrogen. And that's because of the next thing we should talk about. This is a rolling prototype. It's an experiment. Basically, Hyundai and Toyota, with their fuel cell vehicles, they want to see how they go in the real world. And so you have the ability to buy or lease a rolling experiment. And you have to be interested in that. If you're not intrigued by that at least, don't get one, because that's definitely part of the experience and part of the reason that you might want to get a hydrogen vehicle. The experimental nature is really obvious when you take a look at some of the forums where I know people out there that have had a problem with their Nexo or their Mirai, and the answer from Hyundai or Toyota was, oh, that's weird. I guess we're just going to buy that vehicle back from you and whatever. And that sometimes is how it goes. If something really truly wrong goes wrong with the fuel cell stack, which is pretty rare, but it can happen, the answer usually is they want it back so they can tear it down and find out exactly what's going on. And that means you get to go find a new car. I truly believe that fuel cell technology has a bright future, but remember that this technology is in its infancy, and if I'm being honest, it's more an embryo than an infant. This is nowhere near where Tesla was when they first brought their first EV to market in the US. Really, the corollary to this in the electric vehicle game would have been something like the 1990s EV experiments, maybe the EV1, the Ranger EV, the very first generation RAV4 EV. That's where things are now with hydrogen vehicle technology. Now, a lot of folks out there say, well, the electric cars have already surpassed them. I mean, in sales, that's not really a hard metric since they haven't sold very many fuel cell vehicles. But remember that pure battery electric vehicles accounted for about 2% of all the vehicles sold in North America so far in 2022, and the projections for next year are still well under 3%. So we're talking about a very, very tiny sliver of the pie. And that tiny sliver of the pie has yet to try and penetrate the circle, which is a large portion of America, people that can't charge at home. Say you live in an apartment or a condo or a townhome where you can't have access to charging infrastructure, something like this is going to make a lot more sense. Also, longer distance vehicles, bigger, heavier vehicles. It would be a lot easier to make a hydrogen pickup truck with 600 miles of real-world range than a battery electric truck at the moment. You also have some of the charging realities. Sure, you can DC fast charge a vehicle at 350 kilowatts or 500 kilowatts, but that puts a massive demand on electrical infrastructure. Whereas hydrogen could be electrolyzing somewhere distant where you can actually turn the power on and off. Maybe you can only generate that power when power is cheapest and greenest, etc. You have that ability to control that production and then move it to an area where power might be needed, say a local filling station. Oddly enough, hydrogen would be easier to integrate in some rural situations where three-phase power is not available, so that makes DC fast charging almost impossible. But the real bottom line is we simply don't know exactly how fuel cell technology is going to go. We only see a limited number of fuel cells currently in development. General Motors is continuing to develop their fuel cell technology, but we don't have any vehicles for them to drive around in. We also have fuel cell technology from BMW, although they have recently decided to start using Toyota's fuel cell tech for the upcoming iX fuel cell. Then, of course, we have the venerable Hyundai Nexo, which at the moment is the most logical fuel cell to get in California. But again, it's a rolling experiment. I'm curious to see how the experiment goes in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. The fuel cell experiment is not going to go anywhere quickly over the next 3 or 4. If you truly believe in a future where 100% of transportation is electrified, then fuel cells definitely have a big role to play in that future. Because if you're going to electrify big electric vehicles like a Jeep Wagoneer or an Escalade or a big pickup truck or a delivery vehicle, fuel cells make a great deal more sense. It's going to give you more room on the inside, it's going to make the vehicle lighter and likely safer for everybody around than driving around 10,000-pound massive SUVs, which is what's going to be required if you really want to have a range of 300, 400 miles in some of these bigger format vehicles. Also, if you want faster refueling times, if you want to get people that live in apartment buildings, condos, etc., to drive an alternative fueled vehicle and they don't have access to charging, this is the kind of vehicle where that could work. Yes, some folks out there might be willing to go to a DC fast charge station 2 to 3 times a week and spend 20 to 30 minutes there to try and get completely full, but far more people are going to be willing to move to a vehicle that you can simply fill in 5 minutes and then drive like a regular vehicle. Also, there's the fact that there is zero vampire drain in this vehicle. The fuel cell stack doesn't brick itself when you leave the car for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. We have so much energy on board, and it uses essentially none of it while the vehicle is sitting idle. In fact, it's 40 degrees out here right now. This vehicle has been on with the cabin set to a toasty 75, and I've only lost 2 miles of driving range over the last, now 3 hours of having this vehicle on. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Obviously, if you want to go zero emissions today, a battery electric vehicle is going to be a lot more sensible for most folks versus a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle like this. But if you want to see a glimpse of a possible future, you want to get yourself something like the Nexo. But again, I'm talking 15, 20 years or more in the future for when we really might see more fuel cell vehicles driving down the road and greater availability. It's really as we start trying to focus electrification and zero emissions driving on people like apartment dwellers, etc. That's where this is really going to come into play. Again, convincing someone to spend 30 minutes at a charging station, that's a little bit trickier than trying to spend just 2 to 5 minutes filling up a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. This experience is much more like gasoline, assuming you can find hydrogen, of course.